I would like to open session 3 on the Gulf and Arabia. We have 2 presenters. We are starting off with Eli N. Dollarhide. Eli Dollarhide is an anthropological archaeologist and visiting scholar at NYU Abu Dhabi. He studies the prehistory of Southeastern Arabia and the Persian Gulf, landscape archaeology, and ancient ceramic technology. Since 2015, Dollarhide has co-directed archaeological research at the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bat, Oman, one of the world's most complete collections of remains from the 3rd millennium BCE. He has received scholarly grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, National Geographic Society, Digital Globe Foundation, and his published works appear in journals including Paléorient, Open Quaternary, and Archaeological Prospection, amongst others. In addition to research, Dollarhide specialises in science outreach and education, and he currently leads environmental education in the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency's Chicago office. And he's going to talk to us about the cumulative impacts of unsettled pasts in prehistoric Southeastern Arabia. Thank you, Eli.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fiona, and for that very nice introduction, and also to YFOT and everyone who helped make the conference possible today. It's been so interesting, I think, to hear such a wide array of approaches to thinking about this topic, and building actually off of our last presentation with Farhad. I'm going to keep us in prehistory, but pull us a little closer to the present here, with a focus really on the 3rd millennium BC. So popular depictions of Southeastern Arabia, both past and present, have long featured mobile groups as the dominant social mode. T.E. Lawrence once famously referred to the region as a factory of nomads. This orientalizing trope of the Arabian nomad lives powerfully on today. Across the UAE, Disney-fied Bedouin camps are state-sanctioned and heavily promoted tourist attractions, promising authentic cultural experiences that collapse time, culture, and geography into packaged tours involving 4x4s across sand dunes, camels, belly dancing, and open-air barbecues. These experiences are often placed in a social evolutionary context as a means of demonstrating how, with the monetary benefits of the petroleum industry, the country has advanced to a developed, globalized economy. Tents and palm frond de riche, like what you see here, are constructed to contrast with skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and Gulf Gothic villas. And really what's a demonstration of how the wealth of oil, when controlled and invested by sovereign wealth funds and spent on projects selected by really just a handful of elites, can catapult a society out of a long-lived Neolithic and into a westernized 21st century. So in a region like this, where government sources directly finance so much history making, and where national narratives are tightly controlled to enhance the state-building enterprise, it would be easy to expect that the archaeological record, too, would be reconstructed to reflect this narrative of direct progression from a nomadic Bedouin lifestyle directly to a 21st century postmodernist capitalist constituency. The picture, though, of mobile lifeways as it's depicted in Southeastern Arabia's early Bronze Age is much more complex. While mobility through pastoral nomadism is well represented in archaeological publications covering the region's early Holocene through on really to the Neolithic, when the domestication of pasturing sheep and goats first occurs, the page on mobility goes somewhat blank at the start of the early Bronze Age, by which I mean the 3rd millennium BC, and is almost completely empty by the early Bronze Age zenith, around 2200 BC. So then, where is this mobility in the early Bronze Age of Southeastern Arabia? And why do mobile groups, in spite of popular fascination, disappear from archaeological narratives in this critical time period of the region's history? One might expect to find an overwhelming collection of volumes dedicated to nomadism, pastoral modes of subsistence, and non-sedentary lifestyles. Instead, the opposite is true. Short distance mobility, by which I really mean intra-regional movement here, has been almost totally ignored in the region's early Bronze Age. So in this paper with you all today, I'd like to explore how the history of archaeology in Southeastern Arabia, which is both complex and recent, has led to this gap in our understanding. In confronting traditional Orientalizing narratives, research on the archaeology of Oman and the UAE has overlooked questions about mobile pastoralism. Instead, it's focused on sedentism and early villages, the foundations of oasis agriculture, and a different type of mobility, which is to say long-distance trade. As the region's archaeology matures, new perspectives on mobility are beginning to emerge. A focus on landscapes encourages us to really reconsider human-environment interactions, including refiguring the resource scarcity that's long been considered the dominant reason for adopting a mobile lifestyle to begin with. Today, mobility no longer needs to be seen as a last resort choice for groups facing some type of hardship. And the archaeological record of prehistoric Arabia is really full of opportunities to find these mobile groups. So this afternoon, I'd like to start by briefly summarizing how mobility in the Southeastern Arabian Bronze Age is most often discussed through long-distance Persian Gulf trade recorded in Mesopotamian cuneiform texts. These records include texts that deal with the better studied neighbors of Southeastern Arabia and Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Iran. And it's exactly these links to these external polities that were a major catalyst for early archaeological research in Southeastern Arabia, which I'll then explore, showing how the history of Arabia's prehistory is shaped by ties to the oil industry and an intellectual inheritance rooted in Orientalism that ultimately led to a lack of research on mobile lifeways. So I'd then like to shift the conversation by introducing the concept of multi-sited communities and presenting a case study for theorizing mobility beyond seasonal transhumance as it applies to my own fieldwork in central Oman at the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bat. Finally, I'd like to turn to the idea of cumulative impacts to consider what the sort of cascading effects of all these disparate data points and how they might really affect archaeological treatment of mobile groups in the Arabian Early Bronze Age. So though intra-regional mobility within Southeastern Arabia's Bronze Age is understudied, really the opposite is the case for long-distance mobility. The diverse trade routes that connected the ancient Persian Gulf region have long been a topic of academic inquiry and were a major drive for the first research on ancient Southeastern Arabia. This map, which may be familiar to many of you here, shows what these cultural boundaries of the Persian Gulf might have looked like in the 3rd millennium BC. Of course, the names shown here reference both the records of Mesopotamian cuneiform texts and the names that archaeologists have given to the groups of material culture that we find and classify. Southeastern Arabia, you can't see my cursor, which is down here in the orange, is labeled as Magan. And we know from these Mesopotamian texts that Magan was an integral part of this really sort of interconnected ancient world. We know from artifacts that they had a particularly close relationship with Marhashi, which today is known as the Indo-Iranian borderlands and primarily southeastern Iran, and Maluha, or the Indus civilization. And it's really because of maps like this that there's been a long focus on connecting Magan to its better studied neighbors, rather than really looking internally at settlement patterns and exchange networks within Southeastern Arabia. One of the great catalysts for Southeastern Arabia's archaeology were exactly these references to Magan in Mesopotamian texts, which record how copper and a black stone called diorite were exported from the Hajar mountain as raw materials and brought to some of the world's first cities in southern Mesopotamia, likely through ports in what today is the UAE. In addition to trade records, cuneiform sources also offer insight into Magan's political relationships with some of its 3rd millennium neighbors. The early kings of the Akkadian Empire, such as Manashtushu and Naram Sin, which you see here, claim to have launched a variety of military campaigns against Magan, even claiming to have defeated its 32 lords. Texts record subsequent returns to quell rebellions and the visit of an envoy of Magan up into the Mesopotamian city of Umma. And I think while it remains tempting to interpret some of these ancient texts as evidence really of political structure, they're probably likely better characterized as propaganda rather than reflecting any real political or social reality. Despite Near Eastern historians' awareness of Magan as a trading partner in the textual record, archaeological research did not begin in the region until the mid-20th century. This relatively short archaeological history, it's not even yet 70 years old, is unique across much of Western Asia. Early excavations were largely a product of individuals associated with the commercial petroleum industry, rather than the Orientalists, biblical scholars, and European explorers who brought Western attention to the prehistory of Iraq, Turkey, and Syria earlier in the 19th century. Instead, it was a team of Danish prehistorians whose previous fieldwork had focused on Northern Europe rather than the archaeology of the Near East, and they conducted these first Western excavations at the invitation of British Petroleum with supplemental funding from local rulers. So their initial publications appear alongside reports of Iron Age excavations in Scandinavia in Danish journals such as Cumulative. So really this history of prehistory has left interpretations of the region's archaeology with a pretty unique legacy. Early excavations were often conducted by scholars with an expertise in a different area of the Persian Gulf who were either a type of archaeological refugee, having been removed from projects in Iran, Mesopotamia, and other areas due to geopolitics, or were actually drawn to Southeastern Arabia through evidence of long-distance trade. In both cases, excavations focused first on the region's monumental remains, primarily the thousands of stone tombs that dot the landscape, and then on identifying a variety of domestic, by which I really mean settlement, contexts. This focus on monument and settlement follows traditional social evolutionary frameworks of early anthropologists like Lewis Henry Morgan, E.B. Tyler, and perhaps best codified by V. Gordon Childe. And those are the urbanization and monumentality form two key material correlates for identifying a complex ancient society. So it follows that while looking for the ancient civilization of Magan referenced in cuneiform texts, these type of contexts would be prioritized. A society with the traditional list, though, of what makes a civilization was, however, not to be found. Even today, evidence for hierarchy, institutions, and craft specialization all remain limited. So this perceived marginality of the area's hyper-arid environment and lack of traditional correlates of social complexity often led archaeologists working in other regions to colloquially look at Arabia and assume that nothing much was happening in comparison to the development of early states that we see in Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, and the Indus. A lack of autochthonous textual history in the region until really millennia later only exacerbated this perceived deficiency. When, for example, once in a moment of truth, while I was describing a grant excavation project to a senior colleague, I was asked, were they really even sedentary then? So I see the archaeological response to this implicit bias about a lack of complexity in Southeastern Arabia's Bronze Age as one important reason of several that localized mobility has attracted so little attention. More recently, the region's archaeology has felt increased pressures to justify its economic value. Much of the research conducted on Southeastern Arabia archaeology is funded either through grants, like in many excavation projects worldwide, or through local government partnerships, which is a little more unique. Government funders especially are invested in developing their tourism industries as well. In Oman, where I work, the primary state agency for overseeing archaeological research is the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism. And that tourism is increasingly seen as an area for economic growth and diversification away from declining fossil fuel prices. Archaeological research projects that produce both sites with tourism potential and uncover artifacts that might fill museums and visitor centers are really given top priority. This is a familiar story across the region, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the next presentation. And Saudi Arabia's development of Al Ula and its sort of accompanying massive advertising campaign comes to mind really as sort of a fantastic example, and one that's really intended to compete in no small way with the sort of classic Western tourist sites in Egypt and Jordan and other areas that have this long history of Western tourists. And I've personally experienced this pressure across the sort of full spectrum, from general encouragement to including restoration and excavation projects, to actually tourism site development and building infrastructure for tourism becoming a condition of receiving an excavation permit. Projects based then around temporarily or intermittently occupied places with modest footprints, those that we might associate with mobility, seem on the surface to offer little to aid this sort of tourism and economic element. And these current funding structures do not incentivize research on nomadism or mobility. Additionally, the current political situation with the erasure of many US federal funding sources for the humanities is only exacerbating this problem further. In addition to funding, taphonomic conditions are another major issue for the development of archaeology based in mobility. Rather than the tells that are familiar to Middle Eastern and Near Eastern archaeologists working in other places in the region, excavations in Southeastern Arabia often reveal deflated contexts due to weather patterns and geology, which really means that millennia of history are often contained in 30 centimeters of soil or less. And of course, even transportation itself actually poses a problem for seeing mobility in this time period, as current archaeological evidence suggests that the dromedary wasn't domesticated until the late second millennium BC, leaving the inhabitants of early Bronze Age Southeastern Arabia with no large domesticated animals to carry burdens across long distances. Not all hope is lost, however. Really, we have lots of new tools and theoretical models that offer opportunities to sort of push beyond these challenging archaeological conditions for finding mobility. Chief among them are the widespread availability of high-resolution satellite imagery, which has provided archaeologists with new data sets for examining mobility and settlement patterns, as well as new theories considering movement across the landscape, which we've been fortunate to hear many of today. Utilizing these updated approaches, I'd like to ask, what might a mobile early Bronze Age Southeastern Arabia look like? So to answer this question, I'd like to really provide an abbreviated look at what the past 60 plus years now of archaeology in Southeastern Arabia has revealed, and then zoom in and make a case study of my own research at Bat, Oman. So archaeologically, the early Bronze Age is divided into two different time periods, both named for type sites within the Emirates, the Hafit and the Umanar periods. Across both of these periods, archaeological sites are clustered around the coast and in the Piedmont zones of the Hajar Mountains, which form really a belt of oases. This general narrative has held that the Hafit period marks the beginning of the transition from mobile pastoralism, with domesticated sheep and goats, to settlements occupied year-round. By the beginning of the Umanar, evidence for oasis agricultural systems, so date palms, of course, providing shade for growing grains and cereals, is increasingly abundant, and settlements with mud brick and stone architecture begin to crop up across the peninsula. As elsewhere in Western Asia, the increase in evidence for farming is linked to permanent architecture and sedentism and what's really an evolutionary framework, which is assumed to herald a decrease in the use of subsistence strategies that incorporate mobility at their core. An increase in the number of identified Umanar period settlements has been cited as additional evidence for a transition away from mobility and towards sedentism. An elaborate early Bronze Age mortuary landscape has traditionally been interpreted as further evidence for increasing sedentism. Tens of thousands of stone tombs dot the landscape, often either overlooking areas with pastoral or agricultural potential, and are later located directly adjacent to areas with domestic architecture. The general consensus is that the tombs serve to both mark the locations of resources and signal access restrictions or define territories associated with them. Really a formalization of social environmental relationships marked on the landscape through monuments. However, the spacing and clustering of these Hafit period tombs also suggests movement and circulation, as they're often located in between later period settlements. Further, recent geospatial research suggests that tombs in some areas of Oman provide evidence for seasonal transhumance, moving seasonally, of course, to follow pasturage availability. And that's based on entrance orientations aligning cardinally with the sunrise across seasons and shifting elevations for these tombs. So to sum up, the two phases of the early Bronze Age have been characterized in evolutionary terms as an arc towards increased sedentism, oasis agriculture, and social complexity. Though I think all of this has more to do with archaeological site selection, research agendas, and funding requirements, as I just discussed. So one of the best preserved of these inland oasis sites is Bat, where I've co-directed excavations for the past 8 years, and where I'd like to turn to propose a model for intra-regional mobility. Since 2020, our project has purposefully reached beyond the site's well-studied oasis core, using pedestrian survey, remote sensing, and excavation to identify new evidence for early Bronze Age mobility and resilience around Bat. To briefly get us all on the same page, The UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bat is located in the Hajar Piedmont in the interior of Oman, and the site stretches across 400 hectares. UNESCO added it to its World Heritage List in 1988, calling it the most complete collection of third millennium tombs and settlements in the world. The site is home to 8 known monumental towers, a necropolis with over 800 documented Bronze Age tombs, and at least 4 distinct domestic areas, where houses, craft production, and agricultural practices all coexisted. Bat's also an especially interesting place to look at short-distance mobility in an archaeological landscape because of the presence of at least 3 small domestic sites located around the site's settlement oasis core. My recent research has been exploring these, for lack of a better term, satellite areas to understand water access beyond the traditional oasis and its aquifers, leading really to broader research on better understanding the process of placemaking and human-environment interaction in this area that's been continuously occupied for at least 7,500 years. So in our most recent research, one of the most interesting discoveries has been a small site located about 7 kilometers southeast of the Bat Focal Center named Raqa al-Madr. So we first discovered this site during survey operations in 2016, and we've since excavated 4 structures at Raqa al-Madr. On the surface, each looks a little like what you see on the slide here, what we really consider to be a typical Umanar-style house, which is a long sort of central courtyard surrounded by narrow compartmented rooms. Each structure was built with a stone foundation and mud brick above. But the differences between Raqa al-Madr and the known Bat landscape became especially apparent after a winter rain during our 2019 season, where the depression flooded and held water for over 2 weeks. We don't often think about wetlands and marshes in the hyper-arid Omani interior, but Raqa al-Madr is really forcing us to reconsider some of these issues. Recent climate change models from paleoecologist Adrian Parker and others suggest that during the late to 3rd millennium BC, heavy rains in the Hajar Piedmont, such as the one that led to this flooding, were probably much more common. In line with our goal of understanding Raqa al-Madr's water management and environmental setting, we've also conducted a geomorphological study of the site, really looking at deep time to understand climate change, as well as how water was held and used, and then, of course, connecting that to our archaeological context. The team, led by Eric Fouache, Alexandre Prosperini, and Tara Boysen-Waller from the Sorbonne, and Max Engel from the University of Heidelberg, excavated 5 sondages up to 3 meters deep, really revealing the deep history of the area, all the way back to sort of green Arabia levels, when monsoon shifts, the most recent of which appears to be about 55,000 years ago, rendered much of the peninsula fertile and home to a variety of rivers and lakes. Their preliminary conclusions suggest that Raqa al-Madr was an ancient lake in the early Holocene, and during the Umanar period, a fertile, intermittently marshy grassland, ideal for animal pasturing. So this environmental reconstruction aligns with the results of archaeological excavations at the site as well. Beyond the architectural evidence, artifacts at the site are generally pretty rare. We've had some broken crucibles and copper production fragments that have been found within the structure's courtyard spaces, indicating at least some level of craft production happening on site. But perhaps more interesting for us today are some of the other pyrotechnic features we found, and this includes several hearths and ovens, including one filled with burnt seeds, which included wheat and barley. Since the site is actually located away from the oasis, cereal cultivation happening directly at Raqa al-Madr would have been challenging without shade, suggesting that mobile populations brought them to Raqa al-Madr from elsewhere. Extensive evidence of sheep and goat dung have also been found and appear to have been the primary fuel used in the ovens that we've excavated. So pulling all this together, what does this evidence suggest really about opportunities for mobility in the early Bronze Age at Bat? So I'd like to argue today that these results really suggest a particular type of mobility, perhaps best characterized as a multi-sided community, drawing from Reinhard Birnbeck's abstract settlement model. Birnbeck's definition aligns with the anthropologist Frederick Barth's idea of integrated communities, where different geographic areas within an economically integrated community specialized in either pastoral or agricultural systems. Rather than extractive center-periphery modes of production, multi-sided communities imply continuous movements of practices, people, and objects between locations on a landscape. A focal center, in the case of my example, Bot, may have been inhabited by some segments of the population year-round, while other parts of the community moved intermittently or occasionally to different areas for social reasons or for subsistence, to take sheep and goats to verdant areas as useful. While at these smaller sites, the segments of the community present continue to make, utilize, and discard the same types of material culture as at the focal centers, albeit in quantities that belie their sort of non-continuous use, forming really an archaeological signature. So unlike traditional models for nomadic transhumance, multi-sited communities position mobility as integral to the settlement system. Mobility is therefore not interpreted as a response to resource scarceness, but multi-sited communities are not necessarily forced to relocate due to external pressure, but rather they select not to live continuously in one center. Community members might circulate between sites within a small geographic area, and indeed a multi-sited community might define itself through its movement across various domestic locations. Sites might consist of temporary camps or smaller settlements with permanent architecture. Communities move between a focal center, like the Bot Heartland here, and these other locations on the landscape. I think that this model fits our current data set from Raqqa al-Madr well, and it also helps to animate the archaeological landscape. Our current hydrological models from the site don't suggest that the rain events that made Raqqa al-Madr pastorally useful were necessarily seasonal. Instead, they appear intermittent and unpredictable. Community members from Bot may have viewed the site as part of their community and sporadically brought their herds of sheep and goats to the site to graze. While there, they constructed buildings like those at Bot that C14 dates suggest were used for over 500 years. And even moving beyond Bot, this multi-sited model, I think, can easily be applied to the data sets of other major early Bronze Age sites within Southeastern Arabia. And I'm thinking here of places like Hashba, Bisya, and Hili, which all present similar settlement patterns with a large center marked by monumental architecture and a series of smaller settlement sites that appear to have been in use all at the same time. So ultimately, I hope that this proposed model of multi-sited communities provides space for mobility to exist without either great social upheaval, be it migration, war, famine, what have you, or for resource scarceness. And I don't pretend that it's an all-explaining framework, but I think it offers one way of pushing mobility beyond either-or discussions that assume it's diametrically opposed to sedentism and settlement. So to conclude, I'd just like to think about these points that I've raised in the context of cumulative impacts and how they sort of relate to one another to really affect archaeological treatments of mobility. So an intellectual inheritance, I think, unique in Western Asia, has left Southeastern Arabia with a rich representation of mobility on a large scale, providing a globalizing context for Persian Gulf interactions within Southeastern Arabia's better studied neighbors. These discussions are driven by external histories derived from Mesopotamian texts, removing agency from actors moving within the bounds of the Arabian Peninsula. Accordingly, relatively little has been written about short-distance mobility after the end of the Neolithic, when a millennium-long evolutionary arc has been created that ends with groups adopting year-round sedentism. Research funding structures that are linked to government economic priorities also don't prioritize research on nomadic mobile groups and compound the challenges created by poor preservation and histories of research rooted in orientalizing and evolutionary perspectives. Southeastern Arabia's early Bronze Age record, however, I think offers incredible potential for mobility, and new data sets and theoretical models, like multi-sited communities, offer ways of seeing movement on local small scales. At Raqqa al-Madr, it's really helping us to consider mobility not as a fallback for when things go wrong, but as inherent in ancient communities. And I think, just to close, future research really empowered by refined climactic models and paleo-environmental reconstructions will help to further animate Arabia's prehistoric past and sort of add to this developing picture. So with that, I'll say thank you to all of you all for listening. And also a huge thank you to our funders, the National Endowment for the Humanities for our fieldwork, and of course our partners in Oman at the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
multi-sited communities idea very much. We've got time for a couple of questions. I think we need to clap.
Thank you, Eli. This was a fascinating lecture, really, and beautifully presented as well.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about your thoughts regarding social organization and social complexity in these sites.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, and I think especially for sure in anthropological archaeology, but I think we can now say in what are the archaeology of Western Asia generally, as we move further and further away from these sort of evolutionary perspectives, right, to think about alternative pathways to complexity and what exactly social complexity means. So as I hope I communicated in my talk, it's previously really been interpreted, especially with the Umanar period, as sort of building to complexity. And we don't have great evidence for hierarchy. We don't have great evidence for really, we definitely have craft production, but we don't have craft specialization per se. And so we're missing a lot of these sort of basic, to go from V. Gordon Childe about what makes complexity. But at the same time, we do have this huge tradition of monumental architecture, right? And we've got different people occupying different places on the landscape, I think with a lot of ingenuity. One thing I didn't have time to get into is really some of the research and interpretations of what's going on in these tombs, which is often where people look at to start thinking about identity in archaeological records that are not rich with text. And the tombs in the Umanar period, so these are these big sort of white ones faced with white stone ashlars. They're actually, they're beautiful. And if you're ever in the region, I can recommend a visit to Bat or to many other sites in the UAE to see them. But they're visible from an extremely long ways away, but the interments of the body are all communal. So it doesn't look like there's any sort of differentiation there. And in fact, they're used for upwards of 300, 400 years. And then of course, subsequently, we find that they're reused in the Iron Age and what we call the late pre-Islamic period as well. So all that is to say, to answer your question, I actually think that this is a type of society that we don't have an excellent ethnographic correlate for. I think this is something, where analogy really fails us. And it's ripe, especially for, some of these models that I think really examine sort of human environment co-production and thinking about, okay, well, what is ingenuity? What is intelligence on the landscape? And how might those interplay with each other without having all this traditional list of what makes civilization, right? Yeah. I hope that sort of answered your question at any rate.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I have two specific questions. You mentioned connection to agriculture in some of the settlements. Can you identify the fields, or is it based on seed findings? And the other thing that came to my mind, the connection to copper or mining as a resource of such community. Does it exist, and can you tell a little bit more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you asked about agriculture, because I realize I have a photo on one of these slides that I'm particularly proud of, because we have extremely poor preservation conditions for organics. It's due to a karstic geology, and so things just do not preserve well. And on one of these slides, I have a picture of some of we've got a wheat and a barley seed. Okay, right, and you might say, well, were they growing that there, or were they importing it from someplace else? And at Raqqa al-Madr, there's sort of no indication necessarily that agriculture is taking place there, right? So this is a smaller settlement site that I'm talking about. However, at Bat, research done by Eric Fouache at the Sorbonne has really identified early irrigation channels that seem to go along with the idea of farming happening in areas directly adjacent to where we find domestic architecture. So we also have some really fantastic and early evidence for what we believe are domesticated date pits. There's the whole sort of idea of the domestication of date palm is being revolutionized right now, actually, thanks to new work based in genetics. And so whether or not Bach can say anymore that it's the earliest domesticated date palm, I think is probably no longer the case. But we have direct evidence for date palm date palm cultivation, if I can't say agriculture. Yeah.
So we can do one more question, but we'll just, we need to reload the next PowerPoint.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So we could, let's continue with the questions.
Yeah.
Going back to the tombs, or the one on the right that's the one stone, is that stone or is it some kind of... Going back to the tombs, the one on the right, is that stone or is that some kind of brick manufactured? And if it's stone, is that a local stone? Because the ones on the left are very clearly just stones, more fields, what I would call field stone, but...
Yeah, so they are both stone. And the Hafit period tombs, which are sort of smaller and slightly simpler, although the actual construction of them belies a lot of technology as well. That's made out of a local gray schist, which you're right, is sort of omnipresent on the landscape around Bot, and also is across the Hajar Mountains. So Bot's not unique for having a lot of these Hafit period tombs. They're literally everywhere in the northern Omani Peninsula. The other tomb is in fact constructed with stone, so that's white limestone, which is slightly different than marble. And it's also sourced relatively locally. But we know that and actually it's being quarried today through permits issued by the government, which are a major concern for us in the preservation of the site. It's actually an Italian quarrying company that comes and still takes it. And so that's made with ashlar masonry. So extremely fine, really excellent indication of some good engineering, and of course having a model for this already in your head when you go to construct it, right? Because the sort of conical nature of the tombs themselves means that each stone has to fit in exactly the right spot. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Eli. So we're just reloading the PowerPoint presentation for our next speaker. Jérôme Rohmer is a researcher with the French National Centre for Scientific Research, the CNRS, UMR 8167, Orient and the Mediterranean. Specializing in the archaeology of the southern Levant and North Arabia from the Iron Age to late antiquity. He received his PhD from Paris 1, the Pantheon-Sorbonne University in 2013, with a thesis on the settlement history of southern Syria from the Iron Age to the early Roman period. Since 2008, he has been engaged in research on North Arabia from northern Hejaz to the Gulf region. In the Gulf, he directed an archaeological project at the Hellenistic caravan site of Taj from 2016 to 2023. In northern Hejaz, he participated in the excavations of the Nabatean city of Hegra from 2008 to 2017, and since 2019, he has been leading a multidisciplinary archaeological project at the multi-period site of Dadan, occupied from the early Bronze Age to late antiquity, and that's the Dadan Archaeological Project. And as you can see, today he will be talking to us about tracing the mobility of people and goods in ancient North Arabia, Bronze Age to late antiquity, insights, challenges, and perspectives. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Fiona. So first, I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers, Fiona, Yifat, and Anna, for inviting me to take part in this highly engaging conference. I'm very flattered and very honored to be here in this prestigious environment of NYU. So in this presentation, I will focus on Northwest Arabia, which is the region I'm currently working on, and which has yielded a particularly large amount of new archaeological data in the last 20 years. I will deal with a long period going from the first phase of settlement intensification, the early Bronze Age, until late antiquity. So, when I started preparing this conference, I've delved into the reference books on the archaeology of mobility that date to the late 2000s and the early 2010s, and I realized that none of them actually included a chapter on the Arabian Peninsula. This may seem quite paradoxical because when we talk about nomads, Arabia Arabia, is probably the first place that springs to most people's minds. Yet, this is telling about the place of Arabia in archaeological research. 20 years ago, apart from Yemen, Oman, and certain areas of the Gulf, Arabia was barely on the map of archaeological scholarship. Since then, the large-scale opening of Saudi Arabia to archaeological research has considerably filled this gap, providing critical new information on the settlement history of the peninsula in ancient times. Building on this new data, a first seminal study on mobility in the Arabian Peninsula was made by Marta Luciani in 2016. This study paved the way for any discussion of this topic, but it is nearly 10 years old now, and it certainly needs an update given the wealth of new archaeological data that has emerged since then. So within the limited time of this presentation, I will attempt to provide such an update based on the new evidence recently brought to light by various archaeological projects working in the region. Recent research on mobility has insisted on several important theoretical and methodological issues which are well known, including the agency of mobile populations, the integration between the nomad and the sedentary, the variety of purposes explaining mobility, and the issue of the visibility of mobility in the archaeological record. The first of these topics, agency, is probably one of the most emphasized in recent research. The idea is that mobile populations are political, social, and economic players in their own right, rather than passive, static entities. So, to acknowledge this idea that mobile populations make history and evolve with it, I've decided to organize this presentation in a diachronic way, according to successive chronological horizons. And in each of these horizons, I will try to highlight the available evidence on mobility in the light of the main topics of this conference, namely agency, visibility, and interaction with external powers. So before I begin, let me just say a few words about the geographic scope of the area under discussion. By Northwest Arabia, I mean mostly the region that corresponds to the northern Hijaz Mountains and their foothills in the northwest part of current Saudi Arabia. The map on the screen features the main pre-Islamic oases known in this area, and 4 of them will be particularly discussed in my presentation. First, in the north, Quraya, a site lying near the Jordanian border, currently excavated by a Saudi-Austrian project. Further south, Taima, between the Hijaz Mountains and the Nefud Desert, which has been investigated by a Saudi-German team for the last 20 years. Still further south, Alula in the south, which actually includes 2 distinct pre-Islamic oases, the Bronze and Iron Age oasis of Dadan, where I'm currently leading excavations, and the Nabatean Roman site of Hegra, further north, which has been excavated by a Saudi-French project for the last 20 years. Finally, to the very south, Khaybar in the volcanic fields between Alula and Medina, which is currently investigated by an Australian and a Saudi-French project. So, let's begin with the first broad chronological horizon, ranging from the early to the Middle Bronze Age, that is from around 3000 BC to 1600 BC. The formation of large oasis settlements in northwest Arabia has long been thought to date no earlier than the late 2nd millennium BC and to result from external factors, either direct intervention by the Egyptians or economic stimulation by the international trade networks of the late Bronze Age. However, in the last 15 years, this scenario that denied any agency to the local populations has been deeply questioned. In fact, the formation of large oasis settlements began in the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BC, and neither Egypt nor the late Bronze Age world economy had anything to do with it. Such an early formation process has been observed by the Saudi-Austrian and Saudi-German excavations at the oases of Quraya and Taima, where massive enclosure walls and large-scale water management systems were set up at that time. From the onset, these settlements show a large degree of connectivity with the Levant, as shown especially by the imported material found in a tomb from Quraya Area M. Therefore, these sites should be understood as a local manifestation of the well-known phase of settlement intensification or urbanization that took place during the early Bronze Age 2-3 in the Levant. Marta Luciani, the head of the Quraya excavation, suggests explaining this extension of the early Bronze Age 2 settlement wave through the model of ancestral pastures, which was put forward by Wilkinson for the steppes bordering the Fertile Crescent. According to this model, the creation of settlements in these seemingly inhospitable peripheral environments was made possible by earlier phases of land use as pastures. In other words, the creation of the large settlements of Quraya and Tayma should not be attributed to external settlers, but to the mobile pastoral groups that frequented the area since the Neolithic and connected the region with its broader environment. Luciani's insight has been substantiated in recent years, although for slightly later periods, by new fieldwork carried out further south around Alula and especially Khaybar. There, the University of Western Australia and the CNRS project have revealed new evidence for mobile populations in the middle and second half of the 3rd millennium BC. The aerial survey carried out by the Australian project has led to identify a very large number of so-called funerary avenues that are very long, continuous pathways bordered with tombs on both sides. These avenues fan out of the main oasis in the region, either connecting two oases together or fading into the surrounding landscape. Based on several excavations made in the tombs, they can be dated between 2600 and 200 BC. These avenues probably correspond to the circulation of mobile pastoral groups, especially since their meandering tracks are characteristic of animal movement. Although other reasons for movement cannot be excluded, they most probably reflect the seasonal movement of sheep and goat herders to and from areas with perennial water availability. Upon the discovery of these funerary avenues, of course, the question that immediately arose was there already a settled population in the oasis? This is precisely what the French project working at Khaybar, led by my colleagues Guillaume Charlot, Rémi Crassard, and Mounira El-Mouchawa, recently contributed to answer. According to their investigations, a first settlement was built in the oasis of Khaybar in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. It consists of a 2.6 hectare town with tripartite or quadripartite building foundations. The creation of this town was accompanied by the construction of a 15-kilometer long rampart, which includes a wide area of about 1,200 hectares, including wide agricultural areas. Later on, in the early 2nd millennium BC, this town was fortified with another smaller inner rampart. The evidence points therefore towards the sedentarization of mobile groups sometimes in the second half of the 3rd millennium at the focal point of the funerary avenues. What is striking, however, as you can see on the map, is the disproportion between the small size of the settlement, 2.6 hectares, and the very vast area encompassed by the outer wall of the oasis, 1,200 hectares. To account for this disproportion, the excavators have put forward the hypothesis of, quote, a multi-scale and multi-type settlement with a central fortified settlement and ephemeral camps. This scenario is strongly supported by recent ethnographic data and provides another example of close integration between the nomad and the sedentary, which recent scholarship insists so much about. Now, turning to another aspect of mobility for the same period, the evidence from Northwest Arabian oasis points to the existence of an extensive network of exchange in the 3rd millennium BC, not only between the various oases of the area, but also on a larger scale. From the late 4th to the early 2nd millennium BC, tombs from Quraya, Tayma, and Khaybar have yielded various artifacts imported from the Levant. On the other hand, archaeometallurgical analysis carried out on copper from late 3rd millennium smelting workshops from Khoraja point toward a southern origin of the ore, either the Arabian Shield, the area between Medina and Khaybar, or the Oman Peninsula. Obviously, Levantine or Levantine-style finds point to long-term communities of practice with the Levant, probably fueled by the high mobility of pastoral groups. However, the big question is, can we really speak of trade as a specialized activity in these early periods? Or are we just dealing with occasional exchange of goods by mobile groups as part of multi-resource pastoralism? In the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, a very important study recently published by Lawson and Al-Otaibi has shown that a long-distance trade corridor existed between the Gulf and South Arabia by 2000 BC, and that it was probably operated by specialized merchants using caravans of donkeys. In Northwest Arabia, however, we do not have enough data yet to assess the existence of such organized trade networks. During the following period, Late Bronze Age, not much is known, paradoxically, about the movement of people and goods. For this period, much of the debate revolves around the issue of the so-called Khoraja painted ware, a distinctive decorated pottery produced at the oasis of Khoraja, which clearly belongs to the broader wave of Late Bronze Age bichrome pottery in the Levant and Egypt. The recent excavations at Khoraja have revealed successive versions of this pottery spanning the late 17th to the early 10th century BC. An interesting aspect of the Khoraja ware is its geographical distribution, which covers a wide area up to northern Sinai in the west and northern Transjordan in the north. Particularly large amounts of this pottery have been found at Timna in the Araba Valley, which is well known, it's a site which is well known as a copper mining and smelting site around the end of the 2nd millennium BC. As you can see on the slide, the prominent presence of this ware at Timna has given rise to several interpretations, including the presence of workers from Hijaz at the mines, trade, or a broader regional identity encompassing the Hejaz and the Araba and relying on a high degree of mobility within the region. Finally, more recently, Kleiman and others have put forward the hypothesis of a community of practice between the metal workers of the Hejaz and those of the Araba Valley, Timna, reflecting the exchange of metallurgical know-how between the two communities. All these models imply a high degree of mobility between the Hejaz and the southern Levant, be it the mobility of workforce, of traders, or of pastoralist groups. However, it remains difficult to disentangle these types of mobility based on the available archaeological record so far. Now, due to various factors, including breaks in the settlement and the material culture, it now seems reasonable to place the beginning of the Northwest Arabian Iron Age around 1000 BC. As far as the topic of this conference is concerned, this date is of particular relevance, of course, because it coincides with the generally accepted date of the domestication of the dromedary, the Arabian camel. This well-known development was of utmost importance for the region, as it allowed for the rise of long-distance trade, the trade of aromatics, during the 1st millennium BC. As Peter McGee has rightly pointed out in his book on prehistoric Arabia, and Yifat made a reference to this earlier today, long-distance trade has often been described as a phenomenon controlled by outside powers such as the Levantine states or the Mesopotamian empires, and in which the populations of Arabia had little or no agency. Yet, on the contrary, it seems obvious that the domestication of the camel was a deeply emancipatory and empowering development for Arabian populations, especially for traders. Indeed, it provided them with an unprecedented degree of mobility and thereby gave them control over the routes and the organization of trade. As pointed out by McGee, it is surely no coincidence that the first time we hear about an Arab caravan in the Assyrian records around the mid-8th century BC, This caravan was precisely trying to pass under the radar of the imperial authorities on the outskirts of a border town at the edge of the desert. I'm talking about the famous Assyrian inscription from Surjore in Iraq, which Yifat showed this morning as well. An inscription which was written by the Assyrian governor Suhu on the Middle Euphrates. In this letter, the governor reports that he seized a caravan of 200 camels led by people from Tayma and Saba, which was furtively leaving the town of Hindanu. It is likely that this caravan was about to cross the desert, thus escaping the main thoroughfares controlled by the imperial administration, particularly the valley of the Euphrates. Aside from Assyrian and biblical accounts, trade-related mobility in the first millennium BC is also documented by internal sources, that is, by the local epigraphic record of Northwest Arabia. At Dadan, a new corpus of Sabaic inscription was published just 2 weeks ago by Dr. Suleiman al-Dhuyaib. These 26 new inscriptions are of utmost importance in that they reveal the presence of South Arabian merchants from the Kingdom of Saba in the northern oasis of Dadan at a very early stage, that is between the 7th and the 5th century BC. Interestingly, at least one individual mentioned in these inscriptions is known from another inscription from South Arabia, which confirms that he moved regularly across the peninsula and beyond, for various purposes, including trade, but also war or diplomacy. This early Sabian outpost therefore appears as the forerunner of the trading colony which was later set up by the Minians at Dadan between the 4th or 3rd and the 1st century BC, a trading colony which has long been known through hundreds of Menaic inscriptions recorded in the Alula oasis around the ancient site of Dadan. Apart from these South Arabian trading colonies, epigraphy provides another type of very interesting information about trade-related mobility, the very routes of the trucks used by ancient caravans. Until 15 years ago, these routes were reconstructed from scarce indications in ancient sources and recent ethnographic data. This approach is well illustrated by Daniel Pott's seminal study of Trans-Arabian routes in 1988, and by Alessandro de Megre's attempt at reconstructing the instance route from Yemen to southern Transjordan in 1997. However, recent epigraphic surveys now make it possible to go one step forward and accurately trace the movement of people across parts of the peninsula. Indeed, unlike other parts of the Arabian Peninsula, such as the East, most of Northwest Arabia is dotted with sandstone or limestone outcrops that are well suited for the carving of rock art and inscriptions. As a consequence, the tracks used by ancient caravans are usually lined with rock art and inscriptions. Indeed, starting in the first millennium BC, the ancient populations of Arabia stood out by their exceptional degree of individual literacy, not only among the sedentary, but also among the nomads of the desert. Inscriptions and rock art have been recorded along desert tracks since the earliest explorations of the region by Western scholars in the late 19th century. However, in the last 20 years, the launch of systematic survey projects using new geospatial tools has led to considerable progress in mapping them. My colleague Leila Neme from CNRS has been particularly active in this field and has been surveying large stretches of the main caravan tracks between Medina and Tabuk since 2004. Here, for lack of time, I will just mention her work on the Saudi part of the Darb el-Bakra, an ancient caravan track linking the Alula oasis with Petra. Her survey, published in 2018, has led to identify more than 1,200 pre-Islamic inscriptions, the distribution of which clearly outlines a path across the foothills of the northern Hijaz. This is the red track, which you can see on the map. Importantly, this work has shown that the ancient trade route did not follow the Islamic pilgrimage routes, contrary to what was previously assumed on the basis of ethnographic analogy. Instead, it was running 20 to 50 kilometers further east. The Islamic pilgrimage route is the green track on the map. So this is just one example, but such discrepancies between ethnographically attested tracks and the ancient roots have been observed elsewhere, for instance, between Medina and Alula, and this is, of course, the limit of ethnographic analogy. Now, compared with the data that can be drawn from inscriptions, trade-related mobility remains surprisingly poorly documented at excavated sites. To my knowledge, well, they remain poorly documented in the archaeological record, generally speaking. To my knowledge, along the surveyed caravan tracks, only one possible campsite has been recorded on the Darb el-Bakra between Alula and Tabuk. This scarcity is probably due to bad preservation conditions, as the caravan tracks usually follow wadi bottoms, which were regularly flooded. More surprisingly, at the main caravan cities of the first millennium BC, Teima and Dedan, it is very striking how meager the traces of long-distance trade are. At Teima, the Saudi-German project has unearthed many Egyptian faience artifacts in an early Iron Age sanctuary of the 10th and 9th centuries BC, but no further imports are reported for the following centuries of the Iron Age. At Dedan, where I'm currently excavating, the only tangible imports of this period are pottery pilgrim flasks, which were massively imported from the Palestinian Shefela or Central Hills, starting in the 7th or 6th century BC. These finds do attest massive imports from the southern Levant, but it remains striking that this type of commodity is the only one represented in the archaeological record of a large caravan city such as Dedan. A possible explanation comes once again from the Assyrian inscription of the governor of Suhu, which I mentioned earlier. When one looks at the contents of the caravan that was seized by the Assyrians, it turns out that most of the products which was bringing back to Arabia are textiles and metal artifacts, that is, perishable or recyclable goods. If such were the main goods imported to Arabia, then it's no surprise that we hardly retrieve them in the archaeological record. For the record, however, it should be noted that this situation changes during the last 4 centuries BC at Dedan, when pottery imports from Egypt and the Mediterranean outlined the trading network of the Arabian merchants of that time. It is unclear whether this reflects an intensification of trade during this period or just a change in the nature of the imported goods and stronger Hellenistic cultural influence during this period. Anyway, the importance taken by trade in the first millennium BC and the ensuing focus on this phenomenon in scholarly literature should not obscure the continued existence of other forms of mobility, including first and foremost mobile pastoralism. Mobile pastoralism was a prerequisite for trade, if only to provide the very large numbers of camels required by the caravans. The nomad's expertise would also be needed to guide caravans through the deserts, as was highlighted by Gifat this morning. Actually, large nomadic tribes or tribal confederations are mentioned in the Assyrian sources of the 7th century BC. The main ones are Kedar, Nebayot, and Massa, but many others are mentioned only by name. These tribes were actively engaged in trade, but their main activity remained the herding of camels, sheep, and goats. As in the 3rd millennium BC, the importance of these highly mobile groups in shaping the cultural identity of Western Arabia, including its sedentary settlements, should be highlighted. From a very early date onward, there are striking cultural similarities between Northwest Arabia and South Arabia. The main one pertains to language and writing. Not only are the scripts which emerged in Northwest and South Arabia in the early 1st millennium BC very similar and closely related to each other, but from a linguistic point of view, there seems to be a continuum of Central Semitic languages from the southern Levant to northern Yemen, possibly including Sabaic. Other striking common cultural elements include funerary steles, as shown by my colleague Jérôme Shinkat in a 2010 article. As was already suggested by Marta Luciani, the explanation, as pointed out by Shitkat not by Luciani, these common points have been traditionally explained by a diffusionist model, whereby cultural innovations were brought progressively southward by migrants coming from the Levant or Mesopotamia. However, the fact that these cultural elements seem to appear at the same time in North and South Arabia strongly argue against this diffusionist model. The evidence rather suggests that they stem from a pre-existing common cultural background. As suggested by Luciani, the explanation for this common background probably lies in the presence of highly mobile communities bonding together these distant societies by moving and interacting along the Hijaz routes. To take up a metaphor previously used by Anne Porter in a different context, this Western Arabian cultural background was probably weaved together by nomadic pastoralists rather than imported by migrants from far away. Another manifestation of the agency of pastoral nomadic groups is their interaction with the neighboring states and empires. I will not expand on this because it's well known and Yifat already talked about this morning, but the North Arabian tribes entertained tumultuous relationship with the Assyrians, and during the 7th century, they intervened several times in the civil wars that burst out within the Assyrian Empire. As mentioned before, their knowledge of the desert and their use of the camel gave them an enormous advantage over outsiders, so that the neighboring empires never really managed to subdue them for more than a short period of time. Now, the relationships of these tribes with the sedentary community of the oasis remain unclear, but at least the Kedar were strongly connected with the oasis of Adumatu, Dumat el-Jandal, which was their religious center. Later on, between the 4th and the early 1st century BC, we know that a tribal group called Lihyan controlled two of the main northwest Arabian oases, Dadan and Taima. Contrary to the received wisdom, there is no evidence that the kings of the tribe of Lihyan ever settled down in any of these oases, and a series of Aramaic inscriptions carved by alleged kings of Lihyan were even found in the middle of nowhere between Dadan and Taima. So it seems perfectly possible that these tribal kings were actually peripatetic and retained a nomadic lifestyle while controlling the most important oasis in the area. It remains difficult to trace the mobile pastoralists of North and Central Arabia in the field, but several types of scripts are ascribed to them: Thamudic B, Ismaic, and Safavitic. The earliest of these scripts, Thamudic B, seems to date back to the mid-1st millennium BC, while the other two were probably used between the 1st century BC and the 4th century AD. Such texts are reported from the various epigraphic surveys carried out in the region, but a special analysis of their distribution remains to be done in order to better understand the mobility patterns of the groups who carved them. To my knowledge, no associated archaeological remains are reported in the existing literature. To finish, I would like to say a few words about late antiquity. In the Arabian Peninsula in general, and in Northwest Arabia in particular, late antiquity, starting in the 3rd, 4th century, appears as a period of general decline, marked by a strong reduction in the number of sites, a decline of the epigraphic habit, and the disappearance of coinage. The causes of this decline appear to be a mix of geopolitical, economic, and climatic factors. One of the main questions about this period is whether this decrease of sedentary sites reflects a downright demographic decline or whether it conceals a shift towards mobile subsistence strategies. And here two views are possible. The first view, illustrated by this quotation by Michael MacDonald, is that in a context of climatic deterioration, the sedentary population of the oasis would have been hit less hard than the nomads, since they could rely on irrigated agriculture. It would therefore make no sense for them to shift to mobile pastoralism. From another point of view, however, oasis societies can be considered as more dependent on their environment. They form hypercoherent systems which are more vulnerable to change and therefore less flexible and adaptive than mobile communities. This latter view is more in line with recent research which emphasizes the resilience of mobile communities. However, in the absence of archaeological data, one model cannot really be favored upon the other. To conclude, it results from the last observation I made that for archaeologists, mobility comes up more often as an explanatory factor than as an observable fact. It is used as part of models aiming to explain the settlement of new areas, the spread of material culture, or the decrease in sedentary populations. It is therefore more often posited than actually observed. The cases of actually observed mobility include mostly burials, inscriptions, and rock art. At large caravan sites, the material evidence for long-distance trade remains scarce, probably because a large part of the imported goods were either recyclable or perishable. However, this situation will probably change with the rapid development of archaeology in Northwest Arabia, and here I would like to list a few non-exhaustive promising avenues of investigation. First, the excavation of campsites. For example, campsite identified by the IDEA survey that was carried out around the Alula oasis at the end of the 2010s and in the early 2020s. Second, further systematic territorial surveys and the mapping and spatial analysis of the inscriptions, a work which is currently undertaken by several projects working in different parts of Northwest Arabia. Finally, an interesting avenue of inquiry is isotope analysis, which should be carried out both on animal and human remains to trace their movements. And that is something we're planning to do at Dadan during the next phase of the Dadan Archaeological project between 2025 and 2028. Thank you very much for your attention.
I have like zillion questions. It was fascinating, really. Thank you so much. I have 3 questions that are connected into one topic, so I'm allowing myself. First of all, I wanted to ask why the year 1000 for the domestication of the camel? I mean, how this year was determined? Because I read some papers trying to push it back to the late Bronze Age. The collagen, teeth issue, all kinds of things, but why the year 1000 for the domestication of the dromedary?
I'm relying on the date proposed by Peter McGee, who did a reference article on this topic in 2014, and he mainly used radiocarbon-dated animal bones from excavated context and the iconography, both from the Levant, the famous reliefs from the Levant, but also the appearance of terracotta figurines in Arabia at sites like Tel Abrak or at Taima, and all these points to a date around 1000 BC. What I can say is at Dadan, the site where I'm leading excavations currently, the first dromedary bones which we have in stratified context date to the 10th or 9th century BC, based on direct radiocarbon dating. So in a way, this confirms this dating around 1000 BC. I think the situation is the same at Taima, where they also have their earliest radiocarbon dated dromedary bones are also from this time span.
This is interesting because in the southern Levant, most of the dates for camel bones appear in the 8th, 7th century. So there is a gap of some years, it's a big question. It's very interesting. I also wanted to ask you about how do you see the involvement of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in this long-distance trade? I mean, in what way was it initiated by the empire, or did the empire enforce itself upon a pre-existing trade system?
I'm not sure the Assyrian Empire is the only player here. We have to think of Egypt as well. And yeah, probably the demand of the Assyrian Empire and Egypt was so huge that it initiated this trade. I wouldn't say it was organized. We don't have evidence that it was actually organized by the Assyrians or the Egyptians. There is an inscription of Ramesses III, which was found around Taima, as you might know. And it's enigmatic because, well, we obviously are dealing with an Egyptian expedition in this area. We don't know what the Egyptians came to do here, whether looking for mines, for ore, where they're trying to explore these aromatics trade routes. We don't know. But I wouldn't say we have evidence for the Egyptians or the Assyrians playing an active role in the organization of the trade, except that the huge demand, for instance, obviously was its condition.
I'm telling you, what made me jump was the slide that you showed of the Southern Levantine pottery of the pilgrims, so-called pilgrims flask.
Yeah.
And some of them are not pilgrims flasks, they are bottles. And these bottles, some of them are quite large, I mean, something like that. And the amazing thing is that we have them, their production center is probably in the Kingdom of Judah. They are made from the Terra Rossa soil. And so they are Judean products, probably. And what amazed me was to find them in Tel Dan in very impressive quantities, including complete vessels and intact vessels, immediately after the Assyrian conquest. And you showed it for the 7th-6th centuries BCE. So this is the same chronological horizon that they appear in Judah and Dan. And I wonder if you made petrographic analysis, did you?
No, we should do petrographic and chemical analysis. Actually, the parallels we have are dates rather from the Achaemenid period in the Central Hills and Shfela, both for the fabric and for the shape. But if you have other parallels, I'd be happy to discuss that with you. I chose them to Andrea Berlin, and
I think it might go earlier. I think so.
Okay, but these are, well, based on the evidence we have, they seem to be real flasks, with two bowls forming the body.
But in some cases, there was only one handle, right?
Yeah, maybe it's a problem with the drawing. I should check that, and we'll talk about it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So we're concluding now this first workshop, as we've said already, it's the first of 3 workshops. The goal of today's workshop was a working definition for mobility. Yesterday afternoon, we had a private discussion as a workshop. This was the main workshop part of the program to talk about that. And this is a conversation that will continue. Does anyone have any general comments they'd like to share before we close? Any sort of summing up? Any reflections?
Maybe we should reflect our. This meeting started with a struggle yesterday. No, not a struggle really, but we had a challenge. We were trying to define some working hypothesis about the question of what mobility is. And honestly, we weren't able to come with an instant right consensus kind of definition. It was very, very difficult for us to define even the borders or the terms. We were able to come up with some key terms, keywords, right? Mm-hmm. And we were evolving around these keywords. It was very, very difficult. And I think that what we saw here, well, last night even with the 2 wonderful keynotes that we heard, and today with the more specific case studies of, the 3 global zones, was that mobility is a very broad spectrum word. And there are, if I refer to the article that you sent me with Gambash, and it comes in various shapes and sizes, in different expressions, and it adjusts itself to the ecology, to politics, to the cultural milieu. And the question is, how can we depart from here to
I think one of the important points that you raised, and one of the points that we were thinking about in the planning for the project, was that we're looking at mobility in arid zones. I think that's a really important ecological delimiter, because we have already seen that there is a lot of ecological diversity already within this arid zone that we're dealing. And certainly one of the points that was made yesterday that one we often came back to in our discussion yesterday was the importance of the fact that we're dealing with just an arid zone. We're not dealing with other ecological regions, which would complicate far more this discussion of what mobility is. Part of the reason why we're having the discussion, and I think you may have, if you've been listening carefully, you may have realised that there's quite a lot of different terms that we use for mobility and pastoralists, and none of these terms are really very accurate. And I think one of the big takeaways for me at least, is that mobility isn't, people that we think of as mobile aren't necessarily actually all that mobile. There's a lot of, one of the words that we came up with yesterday was movement, and that might be more appropriate in terms of being able to move away from the perceived cyclical nature of mobility. So that's one of the key words, I think.
I think that one thing that came up repeatedly in our talks, I think in all our talks almost, was the issue of historiography.
Yes.
Which was very, very important. And in a way, we are all bounded to a very limited set of expectations that were dictated by past scholarship and are subjected to colonial past, to the biased view in which those desert societies and desert communities were described by external powers who wanted to glorify their own right, their own politics and their own interests. And so one of the challenges maybe for the future will be how to decipher, how to crack the code in order to find the way those societies perceive themselves from the inside rather than just looked from the outside, which is, and to go, well, I agree that ecology is very, very important. Ecology dictates strategy. That's what I believe. But how can we go beyond ecology, beyond ecological adaptation? How can we go to social complexity and political organization and interaction with external political powers and issues of trade and agency and identity and lifestyle and ethnicity and so on and so forth? This is something that I think that being aware is the first important thing that we can do. And I don't know, maybe someone else has other thoughts.
Yeah, I think in terms of their agency, it's very important to highlight that the mobile communities ensured connectivity within and between societies. Basically, when we look at the maps of the ancient world, there are gaps, there are empty spaces, and what we're trying to do with the archaeology of mobility is filling these gaps. And these gaps, as you said rightly this morning, well, these deserts, they unite rather than they divide like the sea. I really like the way you phrased it. And actually, yeah, the agency of mobile community, for me, it lies in this ability to weave together distant communities, distant society, and to shape ancient societies, even the sedentary ones to which they're intimately connected, as was pointed out several times.
If I may add to this, I think that what happened, what actually was revealed from today's presentations is that we are very roughly speaking about two modes of two patterns of movement and mobility. One, it can be defined by the caravan trade, but the crossing. So we saw how to cross the Kizilkum. The incense route crosses the Arabian trade. If you go to the Sahara, in Morocco, Sijil Massa to Timbuktu, there's a whole culture of movement, of mobility, which involves crossing these arid or desert areas. Central Asia, even if you look at the Gobi Desert, with much less clear pattern of caravan trade, but it's the issue of crossing in one hand, usually by foreign entities or people coming outside of the region. And then you have these mobile communities who live actually in the same regions. And what came to my mind, again, in terms of definition, is maybe to use, to connect these mobile communities into what a late colleague of mine called fragility zones. So there's a network which is very much tied to arid zone in which the communities living there in this very fragile area, which are dependent to climatic fluctuations, are dependent to imperial power, they have to combine a number of sources for their daily livelihood, which means pastoral nomadism as maybe the first option. If it doesn't work in certain periods, you adopt agriculture, you're going to trade, you're going to serve as a labor source in nearby sedentary areas. So if I'm trying to look forward to the next meeting, if we'll try to weave these two patterns of movement, maybe out of this can come a more precise definition, which is not necessarily can be applied to every single region, and maybe that has to be modified to different regions in what you've seen here in the Eurasian area and even beyond.
Also, we agreed that we have to take into account the interconnectedness of arid zone communities. It's not like they are small and separated, isolated groups, but from history we know that in Central Asia they were easily mobilized as a reaction to sedentary empires. Whenever, for example, in China, a huge empire has established in the steppes, was as a response to it exactly the same, in the same way there was a huge empire established. So they were acting very quickly. There was a tribal system. They all knew each other. They split out, like Fiona has shown us, the Kızılkum Desert, all like crowded in a way. So all the areas are split, divided, and allocated to certain groups, to certain tribes. And everybody knows its own place, its own territory. They're very territorial, every tribe. So, and they are interconnected. They are very quick in terms of response to outside events, like political events, for example.
If I can just add one thing, I think on these issues of sort of fragility and agency, I think there's also, we experience, but those are also relevant for us as archaeologists, as researchers, right? And I think that's, you know, it came up very clearly in your talk, Gideon, as you showed some of those photos of what the abandoned campsites looked like, and in a question from the audience, right? Could you walk us through what is this? Because it's a tough sell sometimes, right? It's not permanent architecture. It's not what, you know, people really want to look at and see often when they think of sort of classic archaeological landscapes. And so there is, I think, a degree of what is our agency as researchers, right? In prioritizing these sort of, you know, to quote Eric Wolf here, people, the real people without history, right? And doing that in spite of, in my own case, in the Gulf, right, of funding structures that don't necessarily incentivize that. But that's true, I think, beyond the Gulf as well.
Yeah, I think the funding is actually a very pertinent point, given what's going on broadly with access to academic funding. If you don't have stereotypically accepted sites, then it's very difficult to write an application as an archaeologist, to work in these landscapes. So this, you know, archaeology is intrinsically multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, but it's also very hard to convince funding bodies that if you're not digging, you're still doing archaeology. And when you're dealing with these, well, I wanted to say ephemeral, but clearly they're not. These communities are not ephemeral. They're just sort of differently structured than what we might stereotypically have thought. And I think that for me is certainly one of the major takeaways from this workshop today. Any other comments to add? Are there any?
Maybe
other...
the audience wants to comment.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? No burning questions that you've been wanting to ask all day.
I actually have a question, if I could.
Anna.
I'm going to poke my head out here. I am interested in, as you've kind of been alluding to, we're in a very particular time where nationalism is kind of resurgent, and I wonder what lessons we might be able to take from your research and from this conference about what mobility can liberate us from, maybe, or what it can, how it can speak to the current kind of resurgence of nationalism, which is very tied into certain ideas of heritage as well, and of where people come from and of who belongs and who doesn't, and what we might be able to take from mobility and from a broader understanding of how humans have organized themselves in the past.
That's a great question. I bet you've got a fabulous answer.
Well, a very interesting question. Well, I have to explain from the beginning, right? in the Soviet Union in 1924, when Central Asia, for example, was occupied by the Soviets, and then they decided to split the country into socialist nations, allocated some area to every nation, assigned them national histories, national heroes, and territories. So from that point onward, from 1924, for example, in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, like two biggest Central Asian states, as far as I know, the historiography, Kazakhs were assigned nomadic background and Uzbeks like sedentary urban background of whole Central Asian heritage. Okay, so in 1991 the Soviets collapsed, and now these countries are writing they are revisiting their histories, they are rewriting their histories, and there is a huge problem now in Kazakhstan. Because the country now, from top, from the government, they say, okay, we are nomads. We have to stick to our nomadic background. So this horse is our symbol. This yurt is our symbol. Okay, the dombra is our symbol. So, but then from Kremlin, from time to time, people like Zhirinovsky say like, okay, the northern part of Kazakhstan actually is Russia, is not like Kazakh place, so in the future we might occupy them back. So then they say, oh, we have to write down our history quickly, say like the Kazakh elites, and the government says, okay, we have to make like anniversary of our statehood 550 years. They did it for the first time several years ago, after the Kremlin said some stuff like that. That was the response. They said, okay, the Kazakh Khanate of 15th century was the first Kazakh state. Now they say, no, we are the Golden Horde people. It's 800 years. So it goes like down there. But they are sticking to nomadic background, nomadic history, okay? And then there are new groups among Kazakh scholars who say, for example, we have this golden man, Scythian, 5th century BC, 2,500 years, very nice, very old, very ancient. We can claim our territory like it's ours, it's nomadic. So, but then there is a problem of language, ethnicity, because the language of Scythians usually, conventionally, is considered to be Indo-Iranian, Eastern Iranian languages, but the Kazakhs are Turkic. So the historians are in crisis. So what to say, what to tell? So either we have to accept our ancestors spoke Iranian languages and then we switched to Turkic, then everything breaks in their heads. Then how come? Like, we are assimilated. We cannot be assimilated. And then on the other hand, they say, no, we have to, this is Iranian, this is not ours. We have to stick to our Turkicness. Then it takes them to Mongolia. That history takes them to East Asia, the earliest Turkic runic writings. Okay? So in Uzbekistan, it's 180 degrees the other way. We were taught that we are like sedentary urban, but all sedentary urban in Central Asia is like Persianate. So now we say, how, come on, this is not our history. We are not Persian, we are not Iranian, we are Turkic. And then there is also a crisis. There are several groups of scholars who are revisiting history, and the new generation says we have to stick like Kazakhs to our Turkicness and our nomadic background, so which takes us to Altai and to Mongolia, and then the rest of the people who, like the elder people who were raised during the Soviets, they say, so you are giving your history to Iran, to Tajiks. This background, this history of civilization, very long one, you say it's not Turkic, it's Iranian, and you are giving away, you are like gifting it to Iran. How come? It's not good. So there is a big problem with this nationalism in writing histories. And during the Soviets, because the territories were made up, it was one historical cultural region, Central Asia, but they split it and they tried to make new nations out of like a big melting pot. And the approach was autochthonous. It's like this territory, you have to justify that your ancestors lived in this territory, which becomes a problem now because people moved all around all the time and they mixed, and you cannot stick either to nomadism or to Turkicness or to urbanism or like sedentarism. So it becomes a problem. But if you look at ethnographic material, which is like 100 years ago from travelers, there were no any like problems with that. People just said, I am from this city, I'm from that city. They never told their ethnic origin. They just said, yeah, I am from that city, and that's it, or from that district. So, a very interesting question. I mean, I don't have the final answer, but...
No, I appreciate that. And I think it sheds light on, I think Eli was the one who used the word history making, right? That it's a political project of how history gets made and who tells it. And then you have to retell it when it doesn't fit anymore. And
yes.
You know, it connects when you go in Sinai, in the Sinai desert, and you ask a Bedouin, where are you from?
Yeah.
He won't give you the name of the place. It's only his tribal identity.
Yes.
Instead, I'm Zaina, I'm Tarabin, I'm the name of the tribe, because there's no real value for a piece of land.
Yeah.
And the tribe can wander. The whole area is under the definition of tribal entity, and the belongings is going to the tribe and not to a piece of land. So.
Yeah.
And this is a lesson that we can take, actually, if you ask about lessons that can be taken from antiquity. You see, when empires and kingdoms advanced into desert or the arid zones, they had some difficulty because unlike other areas, border zones, for example, where they met consolidated and well-defined political entities like other states or other empires, in the desert, they found this tribal configuration and they had to define them and they had to put the borders. And this brought about all kinds of issues of me and the other, and how the other, right, as an ethnic generator sometimes. And they had, for example, they took, what is the name Arabs? This is the name Arab is an external name that was given to desert societies from the outside, similar to the name Arameans or Phoenicians. These are the Assyrians defined those nations in those groups in those names, because they say, okay, these are all the people that live to the west of the Euphrates River. These are all the people that live in the desert, and so on and so forth. And the affiliation was actually tribal, as Gideon has just pointed, and nothing else. But what we can take is that, first of all, the concept of borders that we are so much used to think, especially in the Middle East, I think, where borders count and political issues matter very much, especially nowadays. This didn't exist. This didn't exist in antiquity. And Jérôme and I just earlier, we work from the two sides of the border, and we were talking. I think that I felt that you continued my. It was like. Right, it was a continuation of the same geographical horizon, or I think that what we can take from desert societies is that identity is there are some components in identity that matters. So barrier practices, cuisine habits, names, things that go back to traditions and so on. But there are some ingredients that are open to translation and that are open to negotiation and that can be influenced. And this is also what we saw. This is how you can explain assimilation, for example, process, acculturation. We didn't talk about Tripolitania in the Roman period as an instance. These societies talked yesterday a little bit about resilience, but these societies had this fluid character that enabled them, allowed them to coexist without too many political issues, without too many clashes, and to find the way to, if we can take something, is the fact that it happened. We heard lectures from the prehistorical era to current days, to the 21st century. So it doesn't matter how regimes changed and what kind of political upheavals came upon the head of those people, they still continued to, they experienced their horrors and destructions and traumas, but the day after they came up, right? They cleaned themselves from the dust and they continued. This is a good lesson, I think.
Thank you.
I think that's a great time to draw our workshop to a close. Thank you for that wonderful question. Yeah. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it.